Hello everyone, and welcome to the Henry Schein webinar series. I'm Dr. Gary Severance. On behalf of the Henry Schein Practice Services Group, we're very proud to welcome Eric Pook from Cirrus Consulting Group. Cirrus Consulting Group is North America's preeminent commercial real estate and office lease negotiation firm for dentists. Eric manages the Healthcare Leasing Team. What Eric's here today is to discuss what is probably one of the largest investments you will make throughout your dental career, the lease of your office. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you, Gary. It's a pleasure to be a part of the coronavirus update webinar. My name is Eric Pook. I'm the Managing Director for Cirrus Consulting Group. Cirrus Consulting Group has been now 26 years helping dentists through all sorts of challenges. And while this is certainly an unprecedented time, I look forward to sharing what we're seeing throughout the landlord community, how we're helping dentists with rent deferrals and abatements and dealing with the major crash crunches we're seeing today, and really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of the series. In terms of the content for today, what we've created is a specific amount of information specifically as it pertains to rent and operating cost obligations, both of financial and non-financial obligations. So a little bit of what we're seeing now. So we have done over 12,000 successful lease negotiations, and we're dealing with landlords from Honolulu to Alaska to Florida through Nova Scotia to BC and beyond. So we're covering all gambits, and we're seeing what is working and what isn't, and how doctors now are dealing with this very, very uncertain times. And it's very unsettling. It's very nerve-wracking. And a lot of the dentists that have been reaching out to us throughout the continent have been, scared and very worried about the survival of their practice. And with the layoffs that have occurred and everyone now working from home and practices and clinics being closed, it's yielded an unprecedented amount of pressure on the dentist, on the entrepreneur, to figure out what is left for cash reserves, right? How do we now deal with rent, which becomes the number one expense for the dental practice? And if this continues to go on for another 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, right? How do we now structure and deal with the landlords? How do we structure our capital preservation to ensure that we come out of the far side stronger than ever? So really appreciate the opportunity to share some best practices, helping to really bring attention to one of the largest financial commitments that the doctor makes throughout the continent, which is the office lease. A little bit about Cirrus. Cirrus is the only firm of our kind in North America. So we are a healthcare and tenant specialized representation firm. That's it. That's all we do. We were very uniquely founded by dentists for dentists, specifically because doctors were graduating from dental school without a significant amount or any business-specific training and experience, and were very excited to start up a new practice and would drive around their local communities and call the sign on the local strip mall that they liked, and before they knew it, they were having the landlord's broker negotiate on their behalf, and they were signing a lease on the trunk of a broker's car that needless to say, created a very unique and in some cases a troubling start to the practice. So we've done over 12,000 lease negotiations. The structure of our firm is pretty unique. We have our own in-house legal, leasing, and consulting departments specifically focused on representing the needs of the dentists in a new start, in a renewal, or for doctors looking to transition throughout and sell the practice in the future. We do a large number of these continuing education courses. We also lecture at the Dental Business Institute that Henry Schein puts on. And, tragically, we were at the booth at the Greater New York Dental Meeting. And now that is unbelievably a triage hospital for the thousands and thousands of people in the Javits Center. So principally today, just to start things off, there's 3 numbers that we include in these type of conversations to bring attention to the importance of the lease. We have 85, 54, and 80. So in terms of that, 85% of dentists have leases that can prevent them from ever selling their practice. Meaning in the assignment and subletting section, the landlord might have complete control or might even be able to terminate the lease just for asking to sell the practice. Additionally, 54% of dentists across North America are overpaying in rent in their practice in comparison to comparable market rates. In addition to that, 80% of landlords structure the lease that will entitle them to a percentage of the practice sale proceeds upon the sale of the practice, based on the consideration language in the lease. So the purpose of today is to touch on not only how to survive through this, but how to thrive. Because we will get through this. We will be stronger than ever. It might look different to what it is today, but it's very important that we start now thinking about, let's hope for the best, but let's plan for the worst, and how to figure out strategies with the landlord to get us through the next 30, 60, 90 plus days. And to make sure that we're not taking on a lot of extra burden by the time we are back in and practicing and ramping things up. So we're going to touch on a little bit of the current economic climate. We're going to touch on 4 critical business impact lease considerations. We're going to touch on the cash flow management, payroll and rent, and what to look out for in the lease agreement. So if you do have a digital copy of your lease agreement, I would strongly suggest following along. In addition to that, we'll touch on some landlord negotiation strategies and what we're seeing that works well in terms of abatement, deferrals, etc. And also, we've had dozens of doctors reaching out to us and retaining us to help in the location search or in the negotiations of their lease agreements. Meaning that as they're looking to across the landscape now, they see an unprecedented opportunity. An opportunity now that is being able to get financing rates lower than they've ever been before, the lowest arguably in our lifetime. Also, they're seeing the opportunity that in terms of equipment and otherwise, great advantages. And of course, now landlords more than ever are very aggressively trying to fill those vacant properties, not knowing how low the economy and how bad things are going to get, as many dentists and more so restaurants and bars and nail salons, barbershops, these ones are the ones that are hand to mouth and having a very difficult time in terms of paying for rent. So in terms of the current economic climate, so we're looking at things from a couple of different perspectives. First of all, is we're looking at sort of a phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. So what we're seeing from the economy now is we're seeing this goal is we're in the worst of it, hopefully, right? We're in the flattening of the curve. It's the idea of isolating and all healthy and sick people being separate, right? Helping the medical community to flatten the curve and help to make sure that we're getting ahead and reducing the infection rate. So, we're seeing a lot of questions and comments and things now throughout all the dental boards about, the incentive packages from the government, how do they apply? But that's one aspect, is access to capital. The other is what can we do with our costs today? We're seeing a lot of the proactive dentists, smart dentists now are preparing for phase 2, which is lots of communications, lots of reaching out through social and others to be planning for the next step. So we're seeing a lot of doctors that are writing up policy and procedural manuals. We're seeing doctors, digging up or planning for wills and estate planning. Or arguably most importantly, now that they're concerned about payment of rents, they're really looking at it as an opportunity to look at and structure and pull out a copy of the lease and to figure out if and how to deal with the landlords. So the news and everything out there today is unprecedented, and I think it's critically important that we look through things with a positive aspect and to start thinking about what that looks like in a month or 2 from now, and how do we help to get ourselves back and better than ever. Because my personal view on the medium to long-term success of the industry remains unchanged. I think that we're going to be heading towards a bit of a super cycle where now, including myself, that had been deferring some of my hygiene and regular scheduled appointments, I'm now wishing I didn't, and it was a perfect opportunity to now come back and wanting to get back in and scheduling things as quickly as possible. So as we come back to phase 2, that's where it's catch-up time. That's where hygiene appointments. Many doctors are ready to, do hygiene and whatever is necessary to get production back up as quickly as possible, especially going through February, March, and April to catch up on some of that missed opportunity, and using constant communication through social or otherwise to help plan to ensure that the revenue is there to pay the obligations such as rent or otherwise when we get back through. So, in many cases with layoffs, the benefits continue. So that's good news that there should be, plus the continual receivables revenue should help that most of the doctors we've spoke to aren't up against an immediate cash crunch, but are now strategically planning about how do we help to deal with May and June in terms of rent payments. Phase 3 then is what we'll see is as we're back to normal, people are back in their cars, people are back into regular lives, and that's where we should see a lot of pent-up demand. We're getting back to a little bit more of the cosmetic types of procedures and other more of the electives as we look forward. So that's a perspective. In terms of the real estate specific market, we're seeing a whole variety. The large institutional landlords, many of which are doing their best to help preserve their top tenants and are offering or able to structure 1 or 2 or 3 months worth of deferrals and other things to help make sure that we get through it. And they're able to get some incentives and support from the government, and that's certainly something that they should be passing on to their tenants. We're also seeing that a lot of mom and pop landlords today have leveraged themselves heavily, and their mortgage comes due, and if they're not getting any reprieve from their bank, they must pass on those expenses to the tenants. And many of them say, look, I have to receive your rent or else I will be in default, and that cannot happen with their mortgage. So we're certainly seeing a very, very unprecedented times, but it yields the opportunity now to focus on some of those key things that we might not have been focused on, such as the lease and the commercial office lease agreement. So what we have here is 4 critical business impact considerations. So again, for those of you following along and looking at your lease, I've identified 4 major components to be aware of in terms of both financial and business clauses that might have an immediate impact to your business or to the survival or thriving of your business. The first is the lease terms. So everyone should know, and please to put into your phones and calendars, when does your lease expire? The ability to negotiate with the landlord, the ability to approach the landlord, and how that conversation goes is predicated based on where you're at. Are you 1 year into a 10-year term? Are you 5 years in? Or are you coming up for renewal in the next year or so? Or heaven forbid, are you month to month? Meaning the landlord could give you 30 days notice and you are required to be out with all your trade fixtures with you. That obviously in this climate could be absolutely devastating. The second question is options. Do you have what's called an option to renew? An option is great for the tenant, which gives you the ability within a certain period of notice, either 6, 9, or 12 months in advance, the requirement to notify them in writing that yes, you choose to stay for another 5 years. Basically means you agree to everything within the lease agreement with the exception of a couple of components, most principally rent. But we want to track that day. You don't want to miss that day, or you will be then required to pay, or those remaining options will become null and void, meaning your ability to stay in the space will be reduced from a 2 5 years. You might think you have 10 years left. That might become null and void, and you might be required to be out of your space by the end of your term, which could be in 6 months or a year or otherwise. We were talking to a doctor just a few days ago. They missed their last option to renew. The landlord didn't remind them, didn't come knocking on their door. They just reached out after the fact and said, by the way, we didn't receive your renewal option, therefore, right, you have no right to stay after 4 months from now. So we thought you wanted to leave. So we're going to start to show this to other dentists and see how it goes, right? Obviously, the doctor, devastated, went through a month and a half of pure hell, and in the end was required to pay a 40% rent increase purely because they missed that option to renew deadline. So that is definitely something to be well aware of. The other one now, top of mind, is who's the tenant? Who is the named tenant? Meaning, is it in your name personally, or is it in your corporation? We get this probably most often because doctors now are thinking, if the worst occurs, and if I cannot pay my rent, what is my exposure? And the short answer is it depends on how your lease is structured. But if you have put the lease in your name personally, or if you have been required to sign a personal guarantee, in essence, that gives the landlord the right to go after yourself personally and or your personal assets, home, car, etc., if you are unable to make your lease obligations. So this is obviously something that is typically negotiable, but is certainly something that you need to be aware of now. Some other core components that we're seeing these days, lots of calls on, is what's my total monthly obligation? You should be clear in terms of what your base rent obligation is and what your common area maintenance obligation is. And within that, are you a gross tenant, meaning everything's included in one set monthly payment, or are you triple net? Triple net tenants are typically a base rent plus taxes, maintenance, and insurance. All of that is included specifically and is all additional charges. Now we're seeing many landlords, they still have to pass on those common area maintenance. They're trying feverishly to reduce it, but per the agreement, whatever costs the landlord incurs, they are able to pass all those costs down onto you, right, on a monthly basis, which could easily be 10, 20, 30, 40% of what your base rent is, especially for newer buildings. So very important to know what those contractual obligations are. In addition to that, other good questions in terms of rentable versus usable square feet, right? Have you ever had your practice measured? How much space are you actually able to use versus how much are you paying for a common area bathroom or a hallway, etc. So on the screen, you'll see that, again, if you're not sure, we're happy to help and review your lease on a complimentary basis, right, through the COVID crisis, and you can email that to info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com. For additional, number 3 is default. So very important that doctors, that we continue to pay rent. It is very important that you continue to pay rent for your practice. If not, if you miss, right, or we're seeing, blogs and dental groups that just say, you know what, I'm not going to pay it. That could be devastating, and that could impact dramatically your ability to come back from this and to be stronger than ever. This might add a huge boat anchor and giving a ton of control for the landlord to hold you in default. So again, please make sure to continue to pay rent, and if in the event you're unable to, then be as early as possible to have a plan to negotiate and have a properly documented lease amendment that would allow you to defer or delay or some sort of a financial agreement with the landlord to help preserve cash in the short term. So default simply means that if you have not met your contractual obligations, what is the laundry list of things that the landlord can do to impact you specifically? One of the main components, unbelievably, is that we received an email with a letter, right, from a doctor on the East Coast from their landlord. They were in a mall, nice, small, probably about 25 specific stores, right, in a smaller community. They received a letter from a large national landlord that stated that we've noticed you've closed your store, you've closed your clinic. We are now holding you in material default of your lease agreement, and as a result, here's all the laundry list of things that are going to happen next that were very, very unpleasant. So these are the type of things that, unbelievably, even through this global pandemic, that landlords are taking this as an opportunity to apply pressure and squeeze the dental practice. So very important that we're aware of what's within the lease. We're not putting ourselves in default, and we start to think proactively about how do we help to protect ourselves in the short term and not get ourselves into any hot water. So also, if you are in default, you might lose your ability to renew your lease and those options to renew, or in a worst case, the landlord might have a termination right, meaning that the landlord can terminate your lease for a failure to make payment or otherwise. Also, is there a cure or remedy period? A lot of questions we have is some may be in breach right now and not even know it. If the landlord's not required to give you notification or give you a certain period of time to cure or fix that default, then very important that we're treading very lightly and not putting ourselves into harm's way by missing something that we're not aware of. So in addition to that, section 4, general terms and conditions, we're looking at the personal guarantee. We mentioned before the exclusivity, the ability to be the only dentist in the space. Also, a lot of questions about being aware if you have a subordination or non-disturbance agreement, SDNA. That is specific to if in the event that your landlord goes bankrupt, does your lease and is your lease subordinate, right, to the mortgage? So in simple terms, if the landlord goes bankrupt, right, does your lease survive unchanged? That's a big question, right? Especially if you've negotiated a good lease and it's protecting you through it. And lastly, is there an ability to sell the practice? Many of you know who have sold it before, you cannot sell your practice without successfully transferring and assigning your lease. Obviously, without a location, what are you selling? Charts, goodwill, right, as well as equipment. But without that location, that can dramatically impact the value of your practice or the ability to sell it altogether. If in default, right, that might waive your ability to transfer that lease. Again, if you're not sure, info at cirrusconsultinggroup.com, CIRRUS consultinggroup.com. We're happy to look at that for you. So on the next slide here, we have the what is a lease? And through all the continuing education courses we've done over 26 years, we always ask this question: what is the lease? Right? And depending on the stage in the career you're at, right, you might have some colorful answers here. But ultimately, it represents a check. Right? The first half of the first page states, here's the total amount we're required to pay, here's who it goes to, here's how often we have to pay it, and here's responsible for it, the corporation or or yourself personally. What's unfortunate is that it's arguably the largest check that you will write to any individual entity in your personal or professional careers. If you're paying $5, $6, $7, $8, $9, $10,000 a month, you're looking at, even over the span of 10, 15, 20, or 20 plus years, a multi-million-dollar commitment. And, if you are just about to sign a lease or to sign a lease renewal, look at it as if that's a $500,000 check, $1 million check. And are you getting the value, or are you leveraging that position? Because that's how the landlord looks at it. Are you getting the value for that incredibly high rate? Or are you just saying, geez, I don't want to disrupt, or I don't want to cause any issues, I better just sign at whatever they propose. Unfortunately, most doctors fall into the trap of just negotiating the first half of the first page, meaning rent, annual increases, and term. Yet there's another 50 to 60 odd pages of stuff in the lease that the landlords invested a lot to properly structure to their benefit. And there's a lot of those that, especially in these uncertain times, let it be unforeseeable circumstances, force majeure, or breach, or other specific components that now everyone's digging through, in some cases, unfortunately, for the first time, about what impact that has. So why? Why is the lease so important right now during COVID-19? As I mentioned before, your business is your location. Your location is your business, and it's the foundation for your practice. Imagine you drive up to your clinic, right, in 2 weeks or 3 weeks from now, and you're just about to start opening again. You stick your key in the lock, you turn your key, and it won't work, right? And you notice out of the side of your eye, there is an envelope, right, taped to the front of your practice, and you open it up and you say you no longer have access to the space, right? Let's think about it for a second. What would you do? Who would you call? What impact would that have to your business? And depending on what happens over the next few weeks, that is something that you want to avoid at all costs, and to be as proactive as possible to protect yourself from it, because your office is your business. And you need to look at the lease as either the rock-solid concrete foundation to build your practice upon, or a crumbling shell that could cost tens of thousands down the road. Of course, right, failure to pay, as I mentioned before, could be catastrophic to your ability to stay in the space. You, as a group of dentists, mean that you spend the highest amount to build out that practice than any other commercial real estate tenant. Right, $100, $150, $200, $250 per square foot to build out. And don't forget all those construction costs and all that improvement to the space, medical grade plumbing, electrical. Who owns that? The landlord. Right? So again, you are an unbelievable tenant, and you need to make sure you have a lease that is aligned with that. Also very difficult and expensive to build. Right? You wake up tomorrow and you say, you know what, I might move the practice across the street. Right? Can you imagine how many hundreds of thousands of dollars that would be? Plus the timelines, double rents, right? Any patient attrition if you were shut down. We touched on the practice sale, and many doctors may want to walk away or leave, or try to sell to a group, sell to a corporation, or sell to an associate. Many are going to want to just, after the end of this, just walk away. Well, even in the lease, you might have a surrender provision that requires you to return your space to pre-dental condition. So whatever it looked like when you moved in, or if you bought the practice, whatever the former dentist had built out, and that could yield another $10,000 or $15,000 of demolition costs just at the time that you're so frustrated and you're ready to throw the keys in the lake, right? That could be a dramatic amount of increased expense. But lastly, it gives you leverage, right? You have an incredible amount of benefit and leverage in a symbiotic relationship with your landlord. And many underutilize that. You've always paid your rent on time, right? You're paying an incredibly high amount of rent. You bring in high quality foot traffic. You have a very low default rate, and you have the highest build-out expenses. You are an ideal tenant. Don't let anyone tell you differently, right? So now it's about, what should the lease do for me? Well, first and foremost, it should provide fair and affordable terms. What do we mean by fair? Well, you need to have someone giving you the data to show what is fair. What's the market rates? What's vacancies? What's trending? How much square footage, right, have been leased out recently? You need the data to help to ensure that you're fair. Next up, we're talking about long-term stability and security. So as we think about long-term stability and security, we need to think about term, right? You should be, if your lease is coming due, you should be now thinking about it from the landlord's perspective. The landlord, right, is able to show their revenue based on a signed lease. So the longer the term of the lease and the type of rent or the amount of rent you're paying are arguably some of their most important criteria. That's how they work, that's how they operate. You should have as long of a term as possible to ensure that you and your patients have the ability to come in, right, to work there, and to minimize your, the unlikely event of being relocated or otherwise. Next is maximizing your flexibility. One aspect that you should look in your leases, or should demand you have in the next one, is something called the death and disability clause. That death and disability clause, in essence, is a specific right that, heaven forbid, something happened to you. It gives you or your estate the ability to terminate that lease and to be able to, in essence, walk away of that remaining obligation. Right? And we've seen many examples over the years, including one recently of a doctor in his early 40s that 3 weeks prior to the grand opening had passed away due to a massive heart attack. So a fully built out practice, right? No doctor, no patients. What's that practice worth? In essence, these are the type of things that we never wanted to think about or otherwise, but in these terrible and uncertain times, it's important that we're aware of what's in our agreements. It's important that we're aware of how to protect ourselves in all these different scenarios, into the, we never thought this would happen, but here we are, right? And to ensure that the lease is giving us as much protection as possible and not putting ourselves in harm's way. And of course, the ability to eventually sell and transfer your practice. And there's lots of financial negotiables. If you're looking at an expansion, or if you're looking at we're looking at a new start, it's still an incredible time. There's 7 major things that can be negotiated on the financials: base rent, annual increases, common area maintenance, landlord work, free rent, fixturing. It goes on and on of key elements that you should be focused on to help ensure that you're minimizing your total expenses to the landlord over the long run. Now, as we look to cash flow management, so this is obviously top of mind for all. So payroll and rent. So most of you have payroll under control through layoffs and otherwise. So now the focus comes to rent. So the lease obligations, again, for those who've been following along, they should now be able to see what your base rent is, as well as what is your common area maintenance, meaning what are my operating expenses? What are my triple net expenses? What's the difference? That's important because as landlords are looking to make deferrals or otherwise, they are more flexible with base rent and less with the common area maintenance fees and bills that they're due, and therefore they want to pass on. Another aspect that can be helpful is if you've recently built out your practice and you received some tenant improvement allowance, or TIA. That's money from the landlord to help build out the new space. They might have paid that over 2 or 3 separate tranches or periods of time. If they haven't paid you yet, right, that might be some extra money that you hadn't thought about since you completed your build out. So just one little best practice there. On the financial components, just adding a little bit more detail to the default section. So you should read that section, understand what happens if, heaven forbid, you cannot or don't have access to capital or couldn't reach out to your bank or Bank of America or otherwise and be able to make the lease obligation. What happens then? So again, don't stop paying rent. A non-payment could trigger 3 months of accelerated rent, meaning that if you miss one, they might be able to require May, June, and July, right, to be paid over the next few weeks. Or it could also, just even worse, could trigger a larger deposit equal to 2 or 3 months rent as well. So you've missed, if you've missed May, right, the landlord could then say, hey, I now have the opportunity for your lease to charge you a much higher deposit amount, which could be, $5, $10, $15, $20, $30,000 just as an additional security deposit that you have no benefit on. In addition to that, again, you might lose those benefits: exclusivity to be the only doctor in the building or area, options to renew, etc. They might be able to ask for all your financial records. And if you've signed your lease in your name or signed a personal guarantee in your lease, the landlord may have the right to ask for all your financials. Last year tax statements, your current bank statement. So they're going to want to see, right, what financial position you're in before they're willing to give you any help. So we touched on the ability to assign and termination rights. Another question we get a lot is force majeure. Force majeure, unfortunately, does not have any impact to your requirements to continue to pay rent. By definition, it's an unforeseen circumstance, which obviously pandemic would be, but it depends on how the lease is structured. Unfortunately, most of the time, depending on if you had anyone helping you for your original lease renewal, it is predicated and is usually very landlord friendly, meaning the landlord might have a relief of performance, but you as the tenant may not. So unfortunately, it is not something that should relieve or will not relieve any of your financial requirements, but it is important to have a review to see and to make sure that if you are closed or otherwise, perhaps there is some other reliefs if you as the tenant were beneficial through there and included. Now, I'm going to spend a little bit of time here in terms of what to look out for. So again, for those of you that have your lease in front of you, we now see, right, over 20 specific clauses in your lease agreement that you can pause and read through and look through to determine what happens if, and to be aware of. And again, if you're not sure or don't know what some of these terms are, and again, you're great clinicians, you're not supposed to know about how each one of these works and how it impacts your practice, right? So therefore, we're happy to bridge the gap. So a few of them that should be aware of is certainly the assignment and subletting provision. That is, again, aligned with, do you bring in an associate? Do you bring in any other 1099s or independent contractors into your space? Are you allowed to do so? right? Most leases are specific that it can only be your business and your employees that are able to practice the use, would be of general dentistry. In that assignment, some of you may be cautioned to know that even after you've sold your practice, you, and perhaps yourself personally, still remain continually liable. Meaning, even after you sell the practice, you are then still on the hook that if the new doctor defaults or is in breach of any component of the lease, that means the landlord can go after you or yourself personally first, and even before the new doctor. So these are the type of things that, if you haven't heard of it before, you do need to be aware of it and to see if it is hidden in your lease. And in many cases it is. Demolition rights. This is another major red flag. Talking to property developers and others lately, what we're seeing here is it's an unprecedented time for developers that are sitting on a large amount of capital, that are looking at smaller landlords running into major financial difficulties, and they're smelling blood in the water. So there is the potential now more than ever that there will be an increased amount of buildings changing hands. And part of that due diligence that many developers do is they look at the rent roll and they look at what the status is of the leases. Are they all month to month? That's great because they can come in, bring the bulldozers, give everybody 30 days notices, and they can start to build condominiums or larger upgrades. However, if there's long-term leases in place, or if there's blackout clauses or other things to protect the demolition rights, there's some great ways of helping to structure or remove these to help protect yourself from these type of very landlord-friendly language. Number 3 is relocation. Many of you, will have a clause in your leases specific to relocation, meaning that if in the event the landlord chooses, for any reason, to move you to the basement, to the 5th floor, or around the corner to the back of the mall, they would have the ability to do so. And depending on how the lease is structured, that might be at your cost, or the landlord might only help with just the moving costs, So it could be a very, very financially devastating component if the landlord was to relocate you. And what if it's a bigger space? What if it's a different layout, That's less operatories, means less production. So again, the relocation clause is key, and let's say that they're going to cover the cost. The next question is okay, well, how many months are you going to be closed while they're building at the new space? And, what we're seeing is usually about over 8% of patient attrition for each and every month that your office is closed. And as a result, that means that, the patient leaves, they go down the hall, they go down the road, and they never come back. So these are the type of things that as we look towards how we emerge through this current global economic mess, what's in our lease? What could the landlord do? And what can we do now that we're at home, we've got some time to focus on these? What can we do to help strategize and prepare and protect ourselves moving forward to make sure that we are, of the top of our class to continue to get ahead of the curve and to, come through this as unscathed as possible? I mentioned the death and disability clause. I heard the example last night of a doctor that was in a motorcycle accident and was unconscious for over a month. And the lease agreement was an incredibly high amount, over $10,000 a month. And now through the recovery and being able to try to get his license back, that lease had no death and disability clause. So the estate or power of attorney couldn't terminate that lease. And now that obligation is falling back to him and dramatically hindering the ability to get back on track. So these are the type of things that if you're unable to practice wet finger dentistry or otherwise, you should, or your estate or power of attorney should have the ability to help with that lease agreement and give you some extra flexibility and protection. Surrender has mentioned what happens if you are to walk away at the end of the lease, and just give back the keys. Speaking to a doctor just last week north of us here, that doctor was responsible for removing everything, all of the leasehold improvements, not only trade fixtures and chairs, but all of the plumbing, the electrical. They had to bring it back to basically dirt and concrete. So he's got quotes anywhere from $10,000 to $12,000 that could be a major component. If you're thinking of, you know what, I'm at my end of career, I just want to give back the keys. So be cautious of what's in there and to be aware of what's in your lease. Overholding. One of the other major components is overholding or holdover. So for those of you watching this, if you are month to month, I cannot stress enough the precarious and risky situation that you are in. Overholding is a section to look in your lease. It specifically states that what happens if you go beyond the initial term or if you miss your options, what happens then? And for most, your leases are able to be increased at 150 or 200% of the base rent for each and every month that you are month to month and not under term. So that obviously could be devastating. And also, depending on how the lease is structured, the landlord may have the right to go back to however many months that you have been month to month and go back and back bill you. So don't forget, we are, as the president says, we are fighting a war, and everyone is fighting for survival. And don't for a second think that the landlords aren't going to be trying to get creative in finding ways to make sure that they survive. So your lease dictates if and how much control you have to protecting yourself. Operating costs, chargebacks, continuing operation. Are you in breach of your lease today? If many Home Depot leases, many of the large box store, right, with heavy anchor tenants, very common that there's a continual operation that states that you must not only be lit, staffed, inventoried, and open for a minimum amount of hours per week. And if not, right, and if it's not specified, that might have a major impact on what your responsibilities are and if you are in breach of the lease because you are not open now for multi-weeks on end. Now, another interesting one is quiet enjoyment. That's worth reading as well because do you have quiet enjoyment, means just as it sounds, to stay in the space? Can you enjoy it? Can you get in? Are you restricted from entry? What does that mean in terms of quiet enjoyment, right? Many of us are allowed to still get in, right, for emergency procedures, and that's where things get gray. Exclusivity, termination rights, and financials are just some of the major ones to be aware of. In essence, again, keeping things specific, here we have the option tree new. So this is just an example found in about 90% of leases. And rather than going through just some of the many issues here highlighted in orange, it specifically also lays out that very clearly that if you have not been in default, you have the options to stay. However, if you have been in default, right, or are in default, those options or your ability to stay in the space and renew the lease become null and void. And that could be, again, devastating if you are unable to come back and practice in the location where you're at today. The assignment clause, again, found in about 75% of dental leases. This specifically dictates whom you can sell to and what the landlord's options are. And if you're looking midway through, it states here that, so let's say you want to sell your practice to Dr. Smith. Dr. Smith now is, you're going to go to the landlord and say, hey, Dr. Smith, we've agreed to a deal, we're going to transfer the lease and send us the paperwork. Right? In this and in many of your lease agreements, it will give the landlord three options. Number one, to approve the request and say, no problems, here you go, Dr. Smith. Number two is to decline and say, you know what, no, we're not letting you transfer to Dr. Smith, and the deal dies. Or number three, the landlord has the right to terminate the lease agreement upon the date or the effective date of the proposed assignment, so the date that you're planning to close. The landlord can say, no, you know what we're going to do? We're going to terminate the lease. We're going to tear it up, terminate the lease, and they might even be able to go directly to negotiate with your buyer. Right? So how much would your practice be worth if Dr. Smith started a lease directly with the landlord and shortcutted you altogether? Right? So this assignment section, as you can imagine now, could impact 100% of your practice sale proceeds, and as many of the practice brokers will describe, they're in real estate hell because they cannot sell the practice without transferring the lease. So these are things to be aware of, and I understand that this can be perceived as more stress and more concern, But it is such a reassuring feeling to know that we do or can protect ourselves. So what is the solution to all of this? So on your screen, you're now looking at the tenant lease cycle. This little circle is how landlords are taught on how to make more money without incurring or spending more money. Meaning that how they engage with their tenants, how they start the renewal conversations, they can now use to their advantage to get more rent or to have more favorable terms. So the best time to start the renegotiations is if your lease is coming due, usually in about 24 months. That's one of the best times to be renegotiating financials, some of the business terms, etc. within your lease agreement. But let's say you reach out to your landlord and you say, great, I want to start talking about my lease, right? What are they going to do? Defer, delay, you know what, we're busy now, it's too soon, come see me in a year. You reach back out at 12 months prior to expiry. Hey, you told me to call back, I'd really like to start putting together a plan. We're busy, we're delayed, right? Then it's 8 months. Now you're getting nervous because you have to give the landlord 6 months notice if you plan to stay, right? You're now scrambling, and then in many cases, right, the landlord has not responded before, or many cases until after the lease has expired, and the option to renew deadline has passed before they'll re-engage in those conversations. Why? Because they have more leverage, they have more control, and they know that 3 months prior to expiry, you're not going anywhere. So time is leverage, and if you are now looking at solutions about how to deal with rent abatements or otherwise, if your lease is renewing, what an amazing opportunity. So now let's touch on landlord negotiation strategies. So right now we're seeing landlords across the gamut. Some are being flexible, some are giving rent deferrals, abatements, half payments, deferring base rent, so meaning moving 1 month to a year from now or to the end of the term, or to taking a month or two and adding that to the monthly payment to be spread out over the next 12 months. There's large ways that we're seeing success in structuring these lease deferral type of arrangements. But the question now is about how the lease is structured and how you're leveraging your position. So if your lease is expiring again in the next 2 years, what's better, right? Think of yourself as a landlord. You're picking up the phone, you get a phone call from the pub or the bar or the restaurant that says, we got a big problem. We haven't been able to pay. We haven't got any, St. Patty's Day revenue, or we've been closed. Our revenue has gone to zero. We cannot make rent. Or the dentist that calls in that says, you know what, I'm focused on the long term of my business. I'd like some assistance in the short term, but now that I'm looking forward and looking at my lease, I see that my lease is coming up for renewal and I've only got one option to remain. I'd like to send a proposal outlining a new 10-year term with 2 5-year options. So you're the landlord for a second. Which phone call would you rather take? So to summarize on this, right, take action now, right? Don't wait until after rent is due, or don't wait until the day before. The more time you have, the better. Read your leases, understand what's in them, have them professionally reviewed, email us a copy, email me, myself, morning, noon, and night, to the chagrin of my wife and little toddler. We're here to help support the dental community and the entire Henry Schein community as one of their key practice services partners, as we have been now for coming up to a decade. So these are the type of things to be aware of your obligations, and more importantly, let's look at the glass half full. Right? There are many doctors out there now that were contemplating expansions, or are looking to start a new practice, and the timing couldn't be better. There's ways of negotiating a new lease in a non-binding way through letter of intents and lease agreements that give you the opportunity to see how low the numbers can go based on these uncertain times. And make no mistake, landlords are very anxious to fill their vacant properties. So it could be an unprecedented times for those new starts with financing rates lower than ever, Bank of America, etc. Amazing practice services team on that front. Landlords desperate, and lots of deals in equipment and supplies. And of course, those looking to renew their lease. What a great time to be having a new conversation about long term. And for you to submit a proposal for a 10-year long agreement to give you protection and continuity for at least the next 10 or 20 plus years, right? What an amazing conversation to have now when landlords are getting just ransacked by all different types of tenants. So hopefully today gives you a little bit of a different perspective. So again, ask yourself, who is your commercial real estate intelligence partner? And on your screen here, you can see that we've got over 95 billion square feet tracked. We have some proprietary reports and data. So if you have any questions about, am I paying fair rent, email us. We're happy to provide a complimentary lease review and rent rate analysis. And really, just to summarize and wrap up here, how do we get success? Well, what we're looking at on screen is really our 8 steps, the Cirrus process to success. 26 years of doing it, over 12,000 times. First and foremost, get all the information. Make sure you have a countersigned agreement from the landlord, meaning that you've signed it and the landlord has signed it. If not, it's not worth the paper it's written on. So email the landlord, ask for a copy of your lease. They will send it to you very quickly. I trust you, they have a copy. Read it, get all the information possible. Now, start thinking about your goals. What are your practice and career goals, and what impact does that have to you? Then have your lease reviewed. Read it, have someone read it for you. Help to highlight some of the things that we touched on today. Number 4 is to get your data. Find out what other tenants are paying in the area, what market prices are, what vacant properties are going for. Know the data. Don't just assume that the landlord's proposing a 10 or 5% increase in rent, and okay, that's okay. Hey, can we do a 2.5%? Okay, great, I got to get back to work, right? Don't fall into that trap. Now more than ever, rent might be lower than it's ever been before. Determine the outcome and strategy, right? It's a carefully choreographed game of chess. Determine what you want to accomplish by the end first, right? And then work all the steps back in terms of how you want to accomplish that. There's a short-term concern, obviously, from cash flow. There's also now a long-term goal of structuring a long-term lease. So what have we not done at this point? We have not yet picked up the phone and called the landlord, which unfortunately is what majority of doctors do first. They don't get the details, they don't think about their goals, they don't get the data, they don't get the research, they don't figure out what they're trying to accomplish, they just pick up the phone and call the landlord, right? And leaves the landlord in complete control of next steps. So again, our team over 26 years now has been negotiating on all the specific financial terms and all the business and legal clauses of the lease agreement, and then getting to a final form lease agreement that everyone is satisfied with, that helps to be beneficial and not just landlord specific. So again, an appreciation for everyone's time. We are doing a complimentary lease review or an analysis call based on your situation. So you'll see the information here on screen about the time we'll spend with you to help support you in your practice, discuss strategies, discuss your situations, and most importantly, send us a copy of your lease. We're happy to look through it, see what is your obligations, to see where we stand today and what we can do to assist. So again, my name is Eric Pook. My direct line is 866-739-9075, extension 3255. Or our group at info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com, and we'd be happy to schedule a time. Please note in the subject line if it is of urgent nature, and we'll certainly prioritize those accordingly. So again, really certainly appreciate all of your time, and Gary, thank you so much for having me on today. I look forward to helping us all get through this, taking a deep breath, and hopefully today we have hope and you're not alone, and that we can certainly all get through this together through establishing a great professional team and good guidance. So appreciate everyone's time and happy to assist. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric, for that timely and critical information. And remember, Cirrus is willing and ready to schedule a complimentary lease consultation with you immediately. And if you decide to move forward with the lease negotiation, Henry Schein can help defer billing should that be needed. Use the website link below to get started on your complimentary lease review. Thank you for attending today's webinar. If you have any questions or concerns, please email us at webinars@henryschein.com. Also, please subscribe to the Henry Schein YouTube page so you'll get notified of additional content. Until we see you again, please stay safe and stay informed.